Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. The Landmark Trust USA is a nonprofit preservation organization stewarding historic buildings in Vermont. As part of their mission, they make these unique properties available as overnight rentals, giving people the chance to experience history firsthand. Their sites include Rudyard Kipling's Nalaka Estate, carriage house and stable, a former maple sugar house, a farmhouse overlooking an apple orchard, and an early 1800s brick cape house. More information is always available at landmarktrustusa.org. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast, and today we have a very timely topic for the upcoming 250th anniversary of the nation. We're going to be talking about that initial conflict that created the nation in a unique way. We're going to be sitting down with Dr. Vaughn Scribner, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas. He's the author of 3 different books, but the book we're going to be talking about today is his most recent, Under Alien Skies: Environment, Suffering, and the Defeat of the British Military and Revolutionary America. So we're going to be talking about the environment and those poor Brits who were forced to endure it during the American Revolution. But before we get there, we love to get to know the folks that we're talking to, and everybody comes from such a diverse, different background. So Vaughn, where did you grow up? And what led you to be so fascinated in this early aspect of American history, writing, all of that good stuff? Was there sort of a spark moment where you dragged to historic sites? What's the story, and how did you end up where you are today?
It's a great question, and it's kind of a multifaceted answer. So I grew up in a little farm town in western Kansas, outside of Wichita, but flat. Any tree in my little town that was there had been planted by a human being. It was a great place to grow up, though. But some of my most formative memories of growing up there are on our family vacations. My parents took us to a lot of state and national parks. We'd go out to Colorado in the summers. I still love the Rocky Mountains, down to the Florida Everglades, up to the Great Lakes. And so from a young age, even though I grew up in this pretty austere environment, which has its own beauty, I would argue, but living in Arkansas now is definitely a different sort of beauty. That kind of engaged me with the environment. But as we took these vacations, I was always really interested in the histories of the regions that we went to. I was always especially interested in Native American history. I was always had my eyes to the ground looking for arrowheads, and pieces, of arrowheads. And this formative memory was I actually found one in Southeast Kansas one time at a family friend's property. And this was kind of this pivotal moment for me because I was literally holding a piece of the past, not just a piece of past in my hand, but I knew someone else who created this. It's this connection in that way. When I went to college at Kansas State University, I was initially an advertising major, but I was taking all these history classes. And so my sophomore year, the very first day, I had earned this internship that was pretty hard to get. I was vice president of the advertising club, and I got this advertising internship with the newspaper, student newspaper. And I sat down and started to work and realized this isn't what I want to do. So I got up and I walked over to the history department and I changed my major. And then later that year, I'll never forget this. I walked out of a class and I was like, man, I love college. I just love the learning environment, all the exploration and possibilities. I wish I could just be here forever. And I realized, oh, wait, I can. If I was a professor, this could be where I work and where I do my thing. And so I really never looked back from that point on. That was definitely my spark moment. But with colonial American and revolutionary history, in undergrad, my professor at K-State was Dr. Louise Breen. And I took all of her classes. She was my colonial revolution. And something about the colonial period just really ignited my curiosity. I grew up loving the movie Last of the Mohicans, the Michael Mann version. And something about that interplay, the diverse interplay among people from all over the place, pushing into this, wasn't new land for Native Americans, but it was for Europeans, this transatlantic global competition for empire. I just found it so just ripe and rife for exploring all the things I was interested in. And then eventually I really got into the 18th century Enlightenment. And so I just find that this British Empire, broadly construed in the 18th century, really allows me to explore anything I'm interested in the present and the past. And so all my books have really come out of that, whether it's my first one about taverns and these places people come together and try to understand their place in the world. Even my second one about merpeople. I don't believe in mermaids, but that all started off as
I'm glad that you made that clear. Too,
yeah, I always have to make that clear.
Just to be clear, I don't believe no one has ever said that on Preserve. We've done like 380 episodes or something. No one's ever had to clarify that yet.
I always have to preface them. Like, I wrote this book about, and it's called Merpeople, A Human History. It's about what we project on these fantastical beings. But it started off as looking at in the 18th century, the smartest men in the world were chasing mermaids around the world. Like, what's going on? And then this most recent one, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, I think, when it comes to like why I wrote this book, but it was reflecting my own interest in the environment around me, and how moving to Arkansas and traipsing all about with my wife in the forests and mountains and waterfalls and rivers, I felt kind of like this outsider coming into these strange new environments. So any of my projects reflect something about me. And because I think that's what you have to do as a historian is you need to choose a subject or topic or let a topic choose you that you're passionate about, because I tell my students all the time, you're going to be the one doing all the work on this. So if it's not something you're interested in, even if it's a good topic, maybe you shouldn't do it, because I don't know if you're going to enjoy it or even be able to give it your all.
It's kind of like good life lesson in general, whether it's about writing a book or whether it's about a career or whether it's about where you live. Like, you got to stick with it, then you might as well enjoy it.
Exactly. Right? Yes. Yes.
And I'm not really sure why that needs to be said, but it's an important thing to underline in this conversation. Just some good life lesson
easy to forget.
From Dr. Scribner.
Yeah.
So you wrote this book, and we're going to put a link in the show notes for people. I mean, it is really timely and a different way of kind of thinking about it, called Under Alien Skies: Environment, Suffering, and the Defeat of the British Military in Revolutionary America. So it is a different way of looking at this. I guess there have been some different books of late that have looked at this, not so much from the Revolutionary period, but I know that there is a book about this in the Civil War, where they talk about sort of environmental determinism and sort of the impact that the environment had and the impact of the war on the environment, which is a little bit different in the Civil War. But why choose to talk about it from this different perspective? Were you just looking for a different way to approach the revolution? Is it because of this personal experience and then wondering what was it like for them? Were you picking up things in firsthand primary sources that you were like, wow, there's just a lot of talk about the environment? What's the origin story of the book?
That's another great question. And I didn't totally realize this until I finished it, actually. So one, I think that moving to Arkansas was critical in this, where suddenly I was feeling not just more of a connection in nature, but also feeling alienated in it sometimes, because growing up on these flat plains, I'm not used to bushwhacking up a mountain or back into some river and worrying about snakes and all this. Okay, so three things here. One, and this is what I didn't realize, especially until I finished the book. I was a sophomore in high school a freshman or sophomore when 9/11 happened. And in my farm town, a lot of the kids who were older than me, when they graduated high school, they went off and fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when they came back, we'd ask them, like, what's it like over there? And they wouldn't talk about their human enemies as much as they talk about the environment, the endless deserts, these camel spiders. And so I think that got in my head from that moment is, in some ways, this is my reckoning with that, because it's the same thing. These British and German soldiers who came to fight in America were the same as these American soldiers who went off to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq in this strange environment when they didn't really know what was going on. They're far from home. So that was kind of, I think, germinating all the time. At graduate school at the University of Kansas, when I was there, it was very, very well known as a bedrock of environmental history. All my best friends in grad school were environmental historians. Dawn Worcester was there at the time, who's kind of known as like one of the two or three creators of environmental history. So while I was there, I had my friends always trying like, Vaughn, you should be an environmental historian. You should be an environmental historian. Well, I started to get into environmental history with some articles on early American pleasure gardens and mineral spring spas. But then I also started this, as I was reading all of these narratives to understand what's going on, I'm reading British and German soldiers' narratives. And I can't even remember what the article was about that I was reading their stuff. But I kept coming across them complaining about the American environment. And I knew from my friends that there are environmental histories of a lot of award-winning environmental histories of the American Civil War, of World War I, of World War II. And as I started thinking about this question, I started looking at the literature, and there just wasn't, there have been some environmental studies of disease in the American Revolution, but no one had really done anything on this. And so this sent me down this rabbit hole but I realized that if I was going to study this, I had to kind of read everything that I could. I wasn't able to go to as many archives as I would have in a perfect world because of COVID. But I have a ton of sources. And so I started to make these connections. So I guess moving to Arkansas, realizing that I had this kind of idea about the 9/11 war in Afghanistan and Iraq, going to grad school where environmental history was huge, and then starting to piece this together, I realized there is this untold story there. And I realized that, to understand why the British lost this American Revolution, we have to look at both realities and perceptions related to this strange environment that they were thrown into. The simplest way I tell it to my students is imagine a person who'd grown up in the Highlands of Scotland, and now they're suddenly down in some swamp in Florida. They've never been in a real swamp. They've never seen an alligator. And so it was this truly alien world that they're cast into, and they didn't do well with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things is that, you mentioned like the award-winning Civil War books that have been written on sort of the environment. And in that case, you have some differences that, people from Maine are down in Georgia and experiencing different things. But this is even more profound. And so It's interesting that nothing had really kind of been written on it to date. And you also think about the cold, too. I mean, They experienced cold, but I'm aware of sort of the experience of British soldiers in the Great Lakes and things like that. And that was totally different to them. I mean, the idea that it could drop, 30 below zero. And they were sort of ill prepared for that as well.
Yes.
I'm curious. So as you're kind of trying to create the framework to write the book, you narrow in on the British, but you mentioned the Germans. So you have Hessians in here. Do you talk about the French? Like, how do you talk about the book? Which foreigners are you kind of zeroing in on?
That's a great question. So this is a hard decision I had to make. So initially I was thinking I was going to have the British and German perspective, but then also bring in the American perspective. Now, I can say I could write a whole other book about the American perspective on this. I get this question a lot, but I made a decision that I was just going to associate or concentrate on the British military, the invading forces. Because now I do talk about the French a little bit in the book because the French came over too, but they weren't here as long as the British. There weren't as many of them. And finally, by the time they came over, they were always kind of winning, especially in popular perception afterwards. Now, the Americans and the French faced a lot of these same difficulties, but it was about perception. So I decided to concentrate on the British and the Germans because it gives a more kind of focused lens. It allows us to trace these men who most of them don't have any real stake in the war. The Germans or the Hessians were a conscript force. Many of them didn't even know what they were doing over here, basically. And the British a lot of the British troops saw the Americans as annoying, but the Americans had something that they were really fighting for. And the French, by the time they came over, did too, because the French, it's payback for the defeat in the French and Indian War. And they want to hurt the British any way that they can. So I also had a ton of great source material for the British. My training is in, I joke that I was hired as an American historian where I am right now, but I'm not actually, don't really study them. My next book going to do more with American history, but oftentimes once America wins the revolution, I'm kind of out. I studied British people who lived in America. So that also, and British people in the empire abroad. So that allowed me to really kind of lean into my expertise more. So I think there are multiple more studies to be explored here. And Blake McGreedy in CUNY is writing his doctoral dissertation right now from a more American perspective of an environmental study. There, David Chung has been working on. So there are some other people doing this right now. So I think I see this as one first step in the direction of this multifaceted environmental historical understanding of the revolution.
And I think it comes at a good time, too, because obviously just because of popular interest in the 250th anniversary, I think there's just a lot more interest that I've seen just popularly about the revolution, thinking
Yes.
about the revolution. But there's also popular misconceptions. I'm curious your thoughts on this and what you get into in the book. Some listeners may be familiar with this sort of, I think it's rooted in some fact, but it's been blown out of proportion, that the British didn't know how to fight in the American landscape. And the Americans were just so great at hiding behind trees and shooting them. And that's how the Americans won the American Revolution. People, this is an audio podcast. He's shaking his head no. But talk to us about that. And where does that come from? And obviously that's a part of this landscape and environmental history used against and sort of used as a piece of almost like propaganda against the British.
Yes.
And what failures they were at using the landscape to their advantage. Where does that come from? How does that center into this story?
Yeah. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. The British no doubt had problems with navigating these pathetic roads in America, huge mountains, lakes, rivers. But it wasn't the Americans doing this. The British won almost every battle that they fought against the Americans. Right. George Washington won one battle. He spent against the British. I mean, he wreaked havoc on the Cherokees. There's so much they called him town destroyer. But he spent most of the time running. And a great example of this is at the Battle of Long Island. The Americans have known the British are coming in 1776. They know the British are coming. They've been gearing up. They know that they're going to come take New York. And the Americans have built forts. They built trenches and redoubts. They are ready. They've sunk ships in the East River. Well, the British land up in Long Island. And once basically they put their bayonets on their rifles and start charging, the Americans all run because they're not a trained military force. They're terrified of bayonets, especially. And then as the British, traipse through this countryside, they're saying to themselves, what if these are actually really good forts? The Americans could have probably stood up against us here, but this isn't a trained military force. And this idea of them being these incredible marksmen and hiding in the trees and using guerrilla warfare as this scrappy little group. This is a 19th century creation, this projection back on them as anti-European. So this is happening, especially this idea of manifest destiny, Americans moving west, creating differences that, they were these. I would even almost link it into this kind of Fenimore Cooper idea of Americans embracing the, quote, savagery of their world and turning it into civilization and superiority. Now, I will say, during the revolution, there are Americans who are really pushing back on this long-held perception of America as this foreign savage place that European philosophers have been saying. And they're starting to say, no, we're all our bounty and diversity, we're not the problem, you are. You can't handle it. It's made us better and stronger. Our natural environment is our advantage. But during the war, they had native allies who were using this. They called it, the country way of fighting. But that definitely wasn't that simple by any means. The British were incredible soldiers. They knew what they were doing. They had been over in the French and Indian War and faced many of these, Braddock's defeat as he's trying to invade the backcountry and he gets wiped out, still lingers very heavily in their minds. And they're constantly making adjustments. But just the sheer magnitude of what they're having to overcome with this environment, it's not just causing them physical destruction, as I mentioned in the book, but something else this book does that hasn't really been looked at beyond the environment is their emotional suffering that comes out of this: anxiety, depression, homesickness, suicide. So this is all creating this kind of quagmire for them of destruction.
Yeah, and I mean, well, there's a lot to unpack there. As a Marylander, you mentioned the Battle of Long Island. I can't go without mentioning that it was Maryland that saved perhaps George Washington,
Yeah.
the immortal 400. And you know what? How did they save them? They saved them by just slowing them down. I mean,
Yes.
they just sacrificed themselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. And in some ways, that's kind of the story of the revolution. Is like, at least from my perspective, has always been sort of just like, how long can we outlast them? How long can we
Yes.
just drain their resources and just make them pay? We don't really have to win. We just have to make them lose.
Yes.
And yeah, so but it is, and I'm so glad that we got you to touch on that sort of popular misconception, because I think even well-meaning people believe that idea, and that would be the story of the environment and the British, and that's not the real story. The story is the one that you're talking about. So, yeah, I mean, how did it, from your perspective? What's the thesis here? Is it a determinative factor? Do you think in the end it was part of the reason that they were defeated, that they just couldn't stay here that long? It made them sick. It made them depressed. And, you know, do you have any sort of favorite anecdotes from that you'd share that, you know, maybe somebody would hear that and then want to pick up the book?
Yeah. So this is always the question of causation versus correlation. I don't think you can well, there's the question of, did the British lose the war or did the Americans win it? You know, they're kind of getting back there. Alan Taylor in his book, American Revolutions, likened it to two prize fighters standing towards the end, two prize fighters just standing in the ring, waiting for the other to fall down. But this book argues that British and Hessian soldiers' negative perceptions or preconceptions of the new world environment, which I say encompasses physical terrains, flora, fauna, weather, and climate, combined with actual wartime realities to elicit really physical, mental, and emotional suffering among their ranks, which figured prominently into why the British did indeed lose the war. There are, of course, other factors here, but a largely overlooked and underappreciated factor is the environment. And that's kind of a duh in some ways, because the environment determines all of our actions in the world and any war. But what's, you know, unique about the American case is North America harbors a more diverse ecosystem than any other nation in the world. We have basically everything from rainforest to deserts to you name it. And so as the British are coming over and invading the east coast of America, going down into Central America and the Caribbean up to Canada, they're hitting all these different climates and regions and seasons and weather, and they're perceiving all of it as more extreme than anything they've ever seen. So I would argue that my thesis of the book is to understand what happened here. You have to look at the environment. Something else the book does that hasn't really been looked at in some is I start my narrative I bring them over on the ship. So oftentimes in American popular memory, the British matter only in so much, and the Germans when they arrive on shore. The British are coming, and you know there are all these famous descriptions of people seeing all the tall mast ships coming in. Well, the thing is, from a British and German perspective, by the time they arrive in America, they've already been at sea for 2 months, and it's been hell on earth. They've faced this veritable conversion process where they're experiencing the American environment one grueling, hellish moment at a time. And then the book also follows them back home after the war to say, like, what were they dealing with emotionally, physically, and mentally after the war? Some of them argued that their experiences in the American environment changed them physically and mentally and emotionally forever. So,
I mean, that kind of makes sense, though,
yes.
right? From the perspective of going back to your comment about the guys who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
They have been changed forever in you know, sort of mentally, obviously, but even physically. I mean, the biome of their gut is probably different because of having lived in Afghanistan for a year or two.
Yes.
And that's probably the same for the British.
It totally is. And they have different language to describe it then on their roles when they would, you know, when they'd get permission to not be in the military anymore. A major term to use was just worn out, which was basically in their body and minds. They're just worn out. They can't do it anymore. And so in that way, this is a very personal, emotional history of the war too. This is really trying to, oftentimes, especially the Hessians, have been seen as these kind of boogeymen or these faceless, nameless invaders. But these were young men who had never fired a gun in anger, let alone sailed 3,000 miles across some bottomless ocean to fight in some strange world that they'd only heard bad things about. And so they're really struggling. Now there are moments of levity and beauty, of course, where they maybe bite into a nice juicy peach or enjoy a sunset. But reading their diaries, that's not what they concentrate on. These are people who are really up against it. So I kind of see this as a war of and against the natural world in their minds.
This is sort of a specific question, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. It's fine if you don't. But how many of them actually of the Hessians and the British? How many of them actually end up back in the UK? Because do some of them end up just staying in Canada and then settling there? They just kind of leave.
Yeah, I have the specific numbers in my book, but the majority go home. Okay, so this is something I had to, and this is the other thing that in our popular memory, there was like, well, the Germans stayed behind. And yes, some of them did. The main reasons the Germans stayed behind was either one, they met a woman. That was a huge thing. They met someone, a person they want to stay with. But the other big one was these German, called them Hessian conscripts, they had no opportunity of owning their own land back in Germany, basically. So for some of them, they're like, yeah, it's bad here, but some of this land I think I could find somewhere. And I'd rather have my own land here and try to make it than go back to Germany. And they also, a lot of them didn't want it to sail back across the Atlantic Ocean again. But it's still, I have the specific numbers in my book, but the majority, especially of British people, went home. And then still the majority of Germans went home who survived the war.
Right. And and part of the reason I asked that is, PreserveCast is powered by Preservation Maryland, and here in Maryland, in the Frederick area, it was a sort of a Germanic region to begin with, and a lot of the Hessians who are held here as prisoners. Yes. At a barracks that is sort of a notable barracks here in Frederick. A lot of them end up kind of sticking around, and there's even descendants today of those Hessians in this area.
And the Americans incentivized them too. They'd be like, okay, join us or stay here and we'll give you land, or we'll if you promise to help us fight, we'll give you land. So there's all kinds of these incentivizing, try to get them to betray the British or, come to the American side. But yeah, it's sorry.
No, yeah, I was just going to ask. I mean, I was kind of trying frame the conversation moving forward, which is so many times when people and countries get involved in wars, they're ill prepared. We're familiar with those stories. And remember, Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't have the armor on the vehicles that they were supposed to have, and so that created problems with IEDs. But there are untold numbers of stories of countries going into war and not being prepared for what they were going to meet. So, what is it that the British knew going in, and how did this change them for warfare moving forward, or did they fail to learn the lesson?
Yeah, so they did learn. So they knew, quite a bit going in, considering, these colonies had been in their possession for a long time. Ironically, the colonies' natural bounty, and its natural diversity is what had made them so valuable to the British Empire. In the French Indian War, they traipsed all over the place. They'd had some serious defeats at the hands of the environment. In fact, after Braddock's defeat, I can read you General Braddock in the 1755, he tries to invade the Ohio Valley region. He gets wiped out by the natives and their French allies. And, one of his people who was on the mission said that we were surrounded by 110 miles of uninhabited wilderness over steep rocky mountains and almost impassable morasses. And so they liken a lot of their defeat to the environment. And even an American, a Bostonian, writes to the Newcastle Courant, "This is and always will be the consequence of old England officers and soldiers being sent to America. They have neither skill nor courage for this method of fighting. They stand no chance. Remember my words. I do affirm that if they send over 20,000 men from Britain, they will only fall sacrifice to the enemy. In this case, the enemy being the environment as much as anything else." And so they knew that this was an issue, and they try, when they come over, this is a major reason they try to take these cities. They want to occupy these these cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, because this gives them an urban center that they feel like they can control. They can get their supplies in and their men, and then they can slowly spread out into this wilderness as they see it around them. That's not how it works. And they do learn lessons from this war. They start to change the way they dress for different campaigns. They change their very strategy. They train their men to bush fight more, to break out of their more kind of regimented, organized kind of what we call squares and things. The Hessians have to do the same thing. So they definitely learn to think about the environment more going forward. But it's a lot of them too, though, in reflecting, just say, we never stood a chance in the first place. We could have employed any strategies or tactics we wanted. The fact of the matter is we got sent into this foreign world where the environment was out to destroy us. And how dare our leaders even send us over here in the first place? And so a lot of them were like, we could have, in their memory, it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to lose this war. It was that America was too big. It was too diverse. The Americans were too holed up, and they just never really stood a chance. But
and is that how?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
A lot of it comes down to that historical memory, where these British people who not only had served in the war, but were also writing about their memory thereof, are saying that. They're concluding this was, how dare, we shouldn't have ever been sent over there in the first place.
Which is such an interesting statement, because how many times have we heard that?
Yeah, I know. Exactly. And that's the thing. This is, I say in my book, it's no novel thing to say that war is hell. But for these British and German soldiers, for a lot of them, it was a special kind of hell. It was. And so this is a tale as old as time, where you have these foreign soldiers sent to fight in an environment, a strange environment, where the occupants know the environment better and feel like they really have something to fight for, even if you're technological. The British had a navy and the greatest military in the Western Hemisphere that the Americans did not. But how you get to your supplies? You're 3,000 miles away. You're not, and locally, as a point I make in the book is, as they kind of try to control the environment around them, they're destroying it. They're turning it against themselves. They're trying to occupy these cities, but they're also desiccating. They're cutting all the trees down for firewood. They're attacking and ravaging nearby farms, and they're turning the areas surrounding them into no man's lands where they're getting sniped at. So just time and again, in going in this environment, whether they're trying to control it or they're being crushed by it, it's just this impending force weighing down on them.
So this podcast is PreserveCast. We talk about preservation of history in different ways. Sometimes it's documenting stories and telling stories like this. Sometimes it's the physical act of preservation. There's a lot of different ways to save a place or a story or an object. I'm curious how, Revolutionary War battlefields are sort of notoriously poorly preserved. Many of them are chopped up, and even by the 19th century, a lot of them were lost. Were you able to go to any places and kind of experience it? Did you try and put yourself in the physical position of a British soldier and go to a place and stand in a swamp, get a leech? What kind of physical experiences did you have writing the book?
That is a great question. So yes, I wasn't able to go to any I've been to them before this, but I wasn't able to go to a specific revolutionary battlefield. However, as I mentioned, my wife and I get into the backwoods of Arkansas a lot. And so I thought about this all the time. We ford ice cold rivers to get to hiking, where we're in above our heads, where we traipse through swamps. We climb up mountains. We have to, and so as I do this, we were on one kind of hard hike one time, and this is when I realized, I was like, wow, I wouldn't have written this book without all of this, because here I am out here, and I'm trying to imagine, well, what if I had to worry about some enemy lurking, or, what if I got bit by a snake right now, or we'll go on hiking trails, and they'll have a trail through the swamp, but I'll tell my wife, imagine if there was no trail here, and you just had to go, and you're up to your waist in this swamp, and you're worried about alligators and you've got mosquitoes attacking you. Suddenly your human enemies aren't even that big of a concern. And so I think about that all the time now. or we'll be on an old log. A lot of the hiking trails are just old logging roads. And I'll tell my wife, like Kristen, her name's Kristen, I'll tell Kristen, yeah, in the revolution, they were trying to have to bring wagons and baggage uh, up roads worse than this. Like this was crazy. And meanwhile, the Americans are cutting trees down to impede their way that they're having to saw through. Or there are forest fires and floods. They're getting horrible rainstorms that hit them. We have rainstorms in Arkansas like I've never seen in my life down here in the South. And so while I didn't go to a specific battlefield during this, I'm thinking constantly now and trying to put myself in the mindset of what if I was a soldier loaded down with my gear? Where would I sleep tonight? How many miles? What kind of shoes would I have on? How would I get? Okay, we go through this river and it's ice cold, but we strip down to basically our swim trunks before we go, and then we put on our dry clothes. Well, these guys weren't able to do that, and they had to get their horses across and all their supplies, and so. Yeah, I think about that all the time now.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely puts a different spin on the revolution and puts a different way of looking at it. And all too often, I think also just the perspective in general is the American perspective. If you're reading American published books, it's not about the British perspective. So this is great. And obviously it's being recognized as Society of the Cincinnati, which is sort of the descendant group of the original officers. So that's pretty cool that the original officers of the American Revolution, their descendants have recognized the book. And I know you said it's up for some other potential recognitions, or at least has been nominated. So it's been successful. Where do you go from here? What's next? What are you writing?
Yeah, so I'm actually working. So right now I'm working on another book about this guy called Lord Timothy Dexter. Just do a Google search on him. A lot of what you're going to find is like what with our memory of the revolution isn't totally true. But he was this guy who was kind of I call him kind of the worst nightmare of Jefferson's vision for the yeoman farmer, or Franklin's idea of Poor Richard, or Hamilton's vision of industry. He was a guy who made his money he got rich by exploiting the poor during the Revolution, and he became this eccentric celebrity in the early Republic. He built a museum of statues of all the great men in the world, including himself. He had his own poet laureate follow him around. He called himself a lord. And so this book's going to be really about this kind of alternate history of the founding of America and about these schemers who helped build America, and these self-promoters, kind of all of our modern day influencers. He was the original influencer, basically, when they didn't have a word for him. So I'm working on that. And then I'm also now really considering kind of a follow-up to this, but more from an American perspective. And the other question is that I get asked a lot, and I have to try to grapple with, okay, well, what about the War of 1812? Because the Americans technically win that one, but they don't lose it more than they win it. And so how do I follow that up? So I'm really got most of my attention on this Dexter book right now, but then I'm probably going to circle back to some more environmental stuff with the American Revolution. So I think there's so much meat on the bone still.
Yeah, well, when you start talking about 1812, make sure you come to Maryland. We'll treat you well here, and,
I will,
and talk about that environmental history. And we'll have to have you back when the Lord Timothy book comes out.
Oh, I'd love to.
We would love to come back and have you have that conversation here. It's just been really fun having this conversation and super timely. Two final questions here. We're careening towards, as you know, the 250th anniversary of the country, and that's 250 years of history, but it obviously, a lot of the focus is on 1776. What are you hoping, as, a professor of this who thinks deeply about this and has been for years, what are you hoping comes out of the 250th? Is there sort of a perspective that you can bring to this that you hope people will have, either it be popularly or even from the academic perspective?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, not just with this Underalien Skies book, with the Dexter book as well, is that I want us to embrace more of the less popular visions of America, because America has done incredible things in its short life, but incredible isn't always good. Okay, so this is this point I make. I mean, America was created by the schemers as much as the dreamers. And I want us to think about kind of both sides of this more, reflect upon 1776, and also realize that the Declaration of Independence was viewed as an act of treason by many people at the time, and we won. So now I want us to lean into, celebrate it, but also lean more into the more uncomfortable facets of this and think like, how does this make us who we are? Who are these people? Not just the founders that we celebrate, and we can look at some of their other sides, but I guess embrace America's complexities, because that makes us who we are. Just like it makes us humans who we are. Everything we do, we aren't proud of. And the same thing is with America. Like, embrace its complexities, embrace the complex nature of something like the Declaration of Independence that did indeed change the world, but in the moment was a very tenuous, dangerous thing. Franklin famously says, in so many words, we all better hang together after this or we'll hang separately. Our founding fathers could have been remembered very differently. George Washington and Franklin could have been shipped back to London for public trial. So I think I want us to do that. I want us to all come together and think about it, and I hope it gives the American Revolution a lot more attention. But it's also, I think, a chance to think about the American Revolution as a civil war, as a British Civil War. And so embrace the complexities is what I would say.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love the title Schemers and Dreamers. That could be maybe a popular book that you write.
Yeah, I have the line in my proposal for the Dexter book. So I stole that from my little proposal I'm working on.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And you're right about like how they could have been remembered, and it's pretty easy to know how they could have been remembered, because how are the British loyalists to the colony remembered today?
Yes.
They're not.
Exactly. Or, how's the Confederates that tried to, that's a different, but it could have gone very different, and it didn't. And I'm glad it didn't. But I think to think about, you don't want to get into too many what ifs in history, but there were a lot of what ifs in 1776.
Yeah. Yeah. Hard to avoid them sometimes.
Yeah.
Before we go, final question we ask everybody: do you have a favorite historic place or site, some place that really resonates with you that you can go back to time and time again?
I do, actually, and it has nothing to do with my actual period.
That's fine. That's fine.
I love Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the surrounding area. I love the city. I love the art, the architecture, the history, the food, the geography. I love connecting with the natural world around. You can visit ancient Native American heritage sites. So that's my place. I would live there yesterday. I love the high deserts of New Mexico. For some reason, they just really speak to me in every way. And so that's my spot. I also love Colorado, but if I was going to give kind of a more kind of a typical site, I guess, I love going over to the UK as well. I love Bath, England, quite a bit. But yeah, I'm going to have to say Santa Fe and the surrounding area. That's my spot.
Love it. Well, this has been such a fun conversation, so timely, and let's have you back and talk Lord Timothy in the near future. Thanks for joining us today, Vaughn.
Thank you.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.